Hello and welcome to On the Brink. I'm Nick Carter. Today we're sitting down with Alexei Zamyatin, who is the founder of Build on Bitcoin, or BOB for short. They are a hybrid L2 utilizing BitVM-v2, and they will be producing a rollup on Bitcoin. They are already live on mainnet, actually. Today we're talking about whether we are going to see these true rollups on Bitcoin. What are they going to look like? Are they going to look similar to what we have on Ethereum? Will the security guarantees be the same? And will DeFi make its way to Bitcoin? And what does that mean for Ethereum? We dive into the deep technical aspects of this. It's a very important topic, and I think we are at an inflection point in Bitcoin Season 2 or the Bitcoin Renaissance, whatever you want to call it. And BOB is right at the forefront of that. To be clear, Castle Island is an investor in BOB. Just want to be extremely clear about that. But I think it's a great conversation, so let's dive right in. All right, I'm sitting down with Alexei, the founder of BOB, Build on Bitcoin. Alexei, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So it's an exciting time in Bitcoin Season 2, I guess we're calling it. Bitcoin Renaissance. Yeah, tell me give us kind of the lay of the land. You know, what's been going on this year? What does 2025 mean for Bitcoin Season 2?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is the hype has kind of come down a bit in terms of the number of new Bitcoin Layer 2s being launched. I think we see a lot of attention shift towards the application level and the DeFi side of things. We're experiencing, I feel, a DeFi ecosystem renaissance across like different L1s and L2s at the same time. So you see more top tier 1 DeFi operators that have been very successful previously come back and look at Bitcoin. I mean, you have Rollup coming back with OptimX. You have Michael from Curve coming back with yield basis, and there's more actually coming up that we're aware of. And that just indicates this general interest in the Bitcoin ecosystem and the ecosystem maturing. So the infrastructure is there. I feel DeFi builders and application builders feel confident that Bitcoin L2s will stick around, that the market's going to continue growing, and I think that's just additional validation of the Bitcoin Renaissance really happening. At the same time, we see more L2s really go to mainnet. I feel that if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said there's going to be more strong Bitcoin L2s live on mainnet at this time, in terms of at least sure, pre-BitVM, pre kind of final stage, but at least scaling and growing. We've been quite surprised by essentially the amount of teams that have actually focused on like ecosystem product development. There's not that many. I think if you kind of split the ecosystem into kind of three groups, some playing the pure TVL game, and we've had a few of those, or like pure marketing plays, and then you have on the other side of the spectrum the very, very technical, strong technical teams who there's a few of those as well, that will build maybe more for ethos and for product and take longer to mainnet, which can work but doesn't always work. And I was expecting to see more teams in the middle that take a product-oriented approach and build things that work with the tools that are available today, while also building on the tech, but kind of have this go-to-market strategy where you have things that you can do now. You start building a user base. You work with your partners, your clients, your apps to gradually improve the security of the system, adding better bridges, adding better security models. So I was expecting to see more optimism in arbitrum plays, I think, or Polygon plays, and I haven't seen as many so far. I mean, I guess BOB kind of fits into this group, and we're seeing slowly a few other teams kind of come out of stealth and go to mainnet, I think, over the next couple of weeks. But that was quite a surprise. But having said all that, what I do see for 2025 is that's a year when essentially it's proven out. Like, we're going to see filtering of between teams that actually can deliver a product ecosystem and also tech, and teams that can't. And we've seen already quite a few people, projects kind of, fall behind, just leave the ecosystem again. many of which, are former L2s, L1s that were in other ecosystems, quickly pivoted into Bitcoin and realized it doesn't really work. Then they pivoted to AI, and now they're going to do probably quantum next. So a lot of those have, moved on. So you kind of can probably see, there's a few top tier teams that are going to be competing over the next couple of years. And then there's, of course, also Starknet, and a few of the well-established ETH players are now kind of following Bob's approach of becoming a hybrid, which I find quite exciting because it proves our point that you shouldn't pick one or the other. You need both Bitcoin and DeFi and the network effects of Ethereum to succeed.
What's the state of the art for a roll up on Bitcoin today in terms of getting to a quote unquote true roll up with kind of the security guarantees that we want to see?
All right, I see we're going spicy from the start. So I think it's important to state that similar to what we've seen on Ethereum, where it took us 5 years to really see the first kind of stage 1, stage 2 rollups really roll out, go to mainnet, Bitcoin's moving faster, but we don't yet have stage 1 rollups on Bitcoin. We have stage 0.
Can you define that? What would constitute stage 1?
I mean, I generally tend to follow the definitions that we see on L2 beats, where a lot of the rollup definition terminology has come from, because I do feel that that's a very good way of just aligning with the definitions people are used to. So there's always some nuance between stage 0 and stage 1. They gradually updated and make it more strict. But generally speaking, the distinction here would be, okay, is it really a rollup? Is there a fault-proof system? And if yes, if it works, if it's operational, then you're stage 1. And then, of course, they're adding some additional constraints for okay, you have a fault-proof system, but you still have some training wheels on with a multisig. And then I think in 120 days from today at the recording, actually, they're going to consider you a stage 0 again, because you still have some dependencies. So they gradually make it more strict. But I think for the listeners, the way to think about this is stage 0 means that you are not really yet a real rollup. You're on track. You may have fault-proof systems active, built in, but they're not fully operational yet. They're not fully activated yet. There's still some centralized components. There's still some bootstrapping going on, which is, fair enough if you're transparent about it. I mean, Base and many other big L2 players on Ethereum are still stage 0.
Yeah, I'm looking at L2 beat. Of the top 15 L2s on Ethereum, only 2 are considered stage 1, Op, Mainnet, and Arbitrum. And even Base is still considered stage 0.
Exactly. So there you have it. It's not something that only, where Bitcoin's the only kind of ecosystem that's, taking a bit longer. I mean, Bitcoin, we've had BitVM2, which I would consider really the actual design that allows us to build optimistic rollups, come out in August. Right? We released a paper with Robin in August 2024. So it's not even been a year since then. So what we'll see this year is essentially testnet rollouts, right? For bridges, that's already happening. So we have our public testnet for the bridge. Other teams are following and rolling out. There's kind of obviously this competition who pushes the testnet out faster. But then there's also this push to mainnet. What I expect to see this year is emergence of sidechain designs first that are really robust with trust minimized BitVM based bridges. So kind of a 0.5 stage, where it's a sidechain which has some level of Bitcoin security, but already has the bridge component implemented in a way that it's trust minimized. So you don't use a third-party multisig or custodian, but the security of the bridge really depends on the security of the rollup, which again depends to some extent on the security of Bitcoin. And then gradually I see then probably towards the end of the year, early next year, maybe a bit later, teams transition to being a full stage 1 rollup. The reason why we don't yet have stage 1 real optimistic rollups on Bitcoin using BitVM is twofold. BitVM is still new, right? So I think it's important to just draw the comparison here between Ethereum that took 5 years, and you still, as we just said, right, only have 2 out of the top 10 that actually have made the step to become a stage 1. Because again, these fault-proof mechanisms are complex. You want to be extra careful once you have a couple of million or $1 billion locked in there. You really want to be cautious. You might run it in parallel with like some training wheels for a while before you turn off the training wheels, and then you really, it's like the code is the law, and if something goes wrong, the money's gone. And in Bitcoin, it's only been what? Since BitVM paper came out, a bit more than a year, 1.5 years since the BitVM2 design was released, which is really the one where we can consider it being kind of that's what's going to production. It's been less than a year.
Yeah, I think a lot of us agree that BitVMv2 is the key technological unlock. What would you say the specific innovation was that BitVMv2 enabled in terms of a rollup on Bitcoin?
So it's not just about the technological innovation, interestingly. It's that when Robin first came up with the idea and published this initial write-up, hey, this is what we can do, and it triggered this gold rush for people to look into a BitVM and this hype, which was great because if you wait and publish a fully period academic paper, you lose a lot of time, and then it's written in a way that perhaps the community doesn't even want to kind of consider because it's written so convoluted with a lot of proofs. So I feel that was the right approach because it got people interested in it. And then the difference to BitVM1 kind of, which was never fully like we together with Robin then and a research team from TU Vienna and Common Prefix and a few other research groups, there is a write-up now with full proofs for BitVM1 as well that is actually now probably deprecated, but some teams have kind of forked off this BitVM1 design and are now have improved it to a stage where it's actually kind of okay, it's quite good. And I think the biggest kind of, if you look at from BitVM, the initial release to BitVM1 and then actual BitVM2 and the further improvements, BitVM0, we could call it, the first write-up was a protocol that allowed you to run some computation between two parties, like you and I could, you tell me you're going to solve I tell you, okay, if you solve a Sudoku puzzle and prove to me that you solved it, you're going to get some Bitcoin. And I lock up the Bitcoin, you solve the puzzle, you don't give me the result, but you kind of, you have a zero knowledge proof and you commit that you prove, or even if you show me the result, but you can prove to me that you need to prove that you solved it. Bitcoin can't verify a Sudoku puzzle, right? But with BitVM, we could basically show that as example, like, oh, we can verify some simple computations or more complex computations actually. But it was a two-party protocol and it used something we call bisection. It's quite close to what Arbitrum actually invented on Ethereum back in the days. The whole crux of BitVM is that we can't run the full program on Bitcoin. So we kind of need to slice it up, dice it up into smaller parts and only run a small part of it. Now, when we do optimistic verification, we only want to run that piece of the program that proves that you cheated, right? So let's say you have a program, and if you're smart about attacking the system, you're not just going to run something arbitrary, right? Because then you're instantly going to lose because you can't even prove the first kind of challenge step. You're going to change the program in a very specific way, maybe even change only one bit. But we'll still find it. But the challenge is, and that's why we have this challenge response protocol, or what we call bisection, and what Arbitrum and Optimism also use on their sides. We are trying to find publicly in a verifiable manner that every Bitcoin node sees where exactly you modified, which step of the program you made the change that now makes it invalid, incorrect. That allows you perhaps to steal the Bitcoin. And in BitVM1, we'd play this back and forth game where I would challenge you and you'd respond. And based on your response, I would know, I have to search in the first or second half of the program. And then I would continue kind of zeroing in, basically running a binary search. So we're searching, left and right, back and forth, like zeroing in on the exact place of the program where you then actually made the change. And that would take over like 70 to 150 transactions on Bitcoin, back and forth over a long period, because ultimately between each two challenges, we need to give us some time because Bitcoin fees might go up, there might be delays. So it's like a couple of months, which was of course not feasible. Yeah, it wasn't feasible, but it proved that it's possible, right? The moment you prove that it's possible, then we can look at optimization. And then BitVM1 cut it down already quite then that was the actual full design for how you can, spec it out. There was a prototype. It was open now to a group of operators. So no longer only two people, but now you could have a group of operators. It could be 10, 20, 30 operators. And the idea was, as long as one of the operators is honest, so one of the 30, one of the 40, your system will be secure because the operators could challenge each other. So now you have a system where you find a bunch of people, like think of a big multisig, right? And that's, I think, a very good comparison to make. In a big multisig scheme, if you find 30 people, 15 plus 1, so 16 need to be honest. Otherwise, they can steal. So if 16 are malicious, so 50% plus 1, your money's gone. In BitVM1, you only need 1 out of the 30. Because if you have one operator, that's honest, this operator will just challenge all the dishonest ones until nobody else is left. And then they're honest, so that's why the system kind of is secure. Then there was quite a bit of progress on like cutting down the number of transactions, and you had a few teams like Fairgate and a few others like spin out, like use that design and start optimizing it further. And by now it's actually quite good. Like they've made a lot of progress. And then again, kind of got closer back to like the canonical BitVM research that then came up with BitVM2. And then BitVM2 really took this, where you had still this bisection protocol, multiple steps, let's say 40 transactions per round per person. So like 30, let's say 40 to 60 probably in total, back and forth, still too slow, still kind of too many steps, and only the operators can challenge, right? So BitVM1 had already 1 out of n operators, but it was permissioned in terms of challenging and still too many steps. And then BitVM2 changed it quite significantly in that we'd say, instead of trying to run bisection, we just have 3 steps. And what we do is we basically have some bigger on-chain transactions, but it's only 3 instead of many, many small ones. So the amount of communication and the chances of, the challenger just going offline throughout the period and missing a step and then the whole system fails, you just get rid of that risk. And now the system is as follows. We take a big program, which we first put into a ZK kind of pre-processing step. So you get a snark prover verifier out of it, which is compressed, much smaller, standard size, much easier to process. And then we split up that program into many pieces. And what BitVM then does is it says, okay, like the operator will commit to these smaller chunks of the ZK verifier. And if you misbehave, so if I'm challenging you in the next, like in a follow-up transaction, so there's a challenge transaction and then there's a response. And in that response, you give me all the intermediary steps. And with that information, I can, in the next step, prove that you're wrong. So we only need 3 steps. These are some bigger transactions. And sure, you can optimize. Again, you can like find a middle ground between BitVM1 and 2, where you kind of don't do 70, but you do like 5 steps. But it's then cheaper for the individual kind of step for the individual user. So obviously a lot of like optimization space there. But the idea was, we, instead of using some like really execution level bisection, we just take a snark and we look at the snark. So we can then just standardize whatever program we're plugging in, which helps a lot already, because anything that you can verify in a ZK snark proof, you can plug into BitVM, which includes entire chains. And we've reduced the steps to 3, right? Maximum 4 in some edge cases, but that's already like it just takes way less time, and it's much easier to actually implement. And the big kind of step here was permissionless challenging. So anyone could challenge, right? That the whole goal of BitVM2 was to make it in a way that it's very close to what you see on Ethereum, where any user could challenge, even you yourself. And that really gives us this proper optimistic rollup security or optimistic rollup bridge security, where, as long as there's one honest user somewhere, your funds are safe. So that's the latest state of BitVM2. There's still obviously like challenges and open research to kind of improve it further, but essentially we're at a state where, from theoretical perspective, from research perspective, we are on par, very, very, very close to Ethereum optimistic rollups on Bitcoin without a fork. And I think that is very impressive in this short amount of time, and with a fraction of the funding that ETH rollups have actually raised.
So what does this look like from a practical perspective? What would one of these kind of hybrid ZK optimistic rollups actually look like on Bitcoin in terms of, I know you touched on it, but trust guarantees and exit window lengths, things like that?
So the interesting part is that the design space is still quite open, and there's like different approaches. So it's quite hard to say like, okay, here's like the definitive exit window. On average, and also like because on Ethereum, right, there was a 7-day kind of challenge period, and then people discussed and realized, oh, actually we could do it in 3 days because there is no reason for it to be 7. It's just like a conservative value. So it's same for Bitcoin, right? If we say, okay, well, we just follow Ethereum's lead here, and we also say 3 days per round, then BitVM just kind of has 2 steps here. So it's like instead of it's a bit longer, so it's you can estimate like 2x of that of the Ethereum kind of challenge period because there's just a bit just the way how BitVM is set up. You need like it's a bit longer. So you'd say what like 7 to 14 days for like full finality, but without optimizations, right? You could cut this down. You could go lower after the system has been live for a while, and you're confident that okay, this works. There's challenges on the system. There's like the challenge response system works. People are online. There's enough people to actually make a challenge and run through it. There's no bugs in the client software because obviously what happens is you start running the challenge and then you discover a bug. You need to fix the bug, come online again, and to continue the system. So I would say it starts probably at 2 weeks plus, and then it will go down over time. And that's fine because you ultimately, well, there's two considerations here. If you use it for bridges, you're probably fine to be slow because the way the BitVM bridge is designed is it's fast for users, it's slow for operators, and operators are going to be professional providers of like liquidity and whatnot. So they're not gonna, they can offset the time. Like they're used to this also on Ethereum. For retail users, it's going to be fast. Like retail users just swap in and swap out. They don't really care. I think a comment here, BitVM comes with a built-in liquidity bridge. Whereas in Ethereum, we have these slower, if you use a native bridge to Arbitrum or Optimism, it takes you 7 days to go back, and you can use third-party liquidity bridges to go faster. BitVM comes with a built-in one by design. So for users, it's generally quite okay. It's the operators who have to deal with rebalancing, between Bitcoin and the L2. But generally, we've seen that there's product market fit for searches of these kind of operators on Ethereum already. I guess the biggest concern isn't time or the trust assumptions we can get right. It's the cost. And there was a very good report by Alexei that studied the Bitcoin fee market under the assumption that you have a couple of these full-fledged optimistic rollup L2s posting data to Bitcoin. Because here is the challenge, right? If you want to be able to do a challenge response game as a rollup on Bitcoin, well, you got to get the data from somewhere to be able to verify if something's wrong and to trigger the challenge. On Ethereum, think of it pre-hard fork. It was very expensive to post the data. That's where Celestia and a lot of these alt DA layers emerged. Now Ethereum forked and it's actually very, very cheap. Well, Bitcoin is very expensive, right? It's the most expensive database in the world. So if you start throwing 4 megabyte block chunks of data in there regularly, well, that's going to be expensive. If you're the only one, and if there's multiple teams doing that, you're just going to drive the P market up. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think we ran our internal estimates, and it's 100 to 1,000 times the X more expensive than what you see in ETH2s right now. Which, is a kind of a problem because we're not competing in an isolated market. I don't think people, and specifically retail users, care that much whether the thing is secured by Bitcoin or Ethereum. They might prefer Bitcoin. It's easier to sell it to them, explain. But if it's 100 times more expensive, well, I'm not sure they're going to like that. And so this really works once either we've improved the DA mechanism on Bitcoin, and maybe there are ways to kind of do this with some trade-offs but you always introduce trust assumptions if you try to optimize there. They might be okay because you use against Bitcoin staking or merge mining. So things that still give you Bitcoin security and you might be okay with it. But then it's it's already maybe 0.7, stage 0.75 or 0.8, not stage 1, but it's okay. Or, well, you have to grow and be big enough and have a lot of users. And then you can basically split the costs among them. And sure, if the cost per user is a cent or 2 cents more, people are not going to care. So that's the kind of 2 options that we have to really, and that's the biggest challenge right now, apart from getting everything running and so on, but that's pure engineering work. the bigger kind of theoretical hurdle is the cost of posting data to the Bitcoin L1. And that's why with Bob, we've taken this multi-phase rollout approach where we start with a design that works and gets us to stage 0.5, arguably. And then we can go to stage 0.8, where we kind of are very close, but we don't post all the data fully to Bitcoin. And then eventually you can say, okay, you know what? We're big enough. Our users, the dApps really want that. It is affordable. Okay, let's start posting the 4 mega, let's start posting data to Bitcoin. And by that time, we actually might already have better ways to compress that data, essentially.
So Bob mainnet is live. Obviously, things are going to change a little bit in the coming months, but tell me about the traction you have so far, and also what kind of applications people are favoring on Bob right now.
So Bob mainnet has been live for, not quite a year, but almost. So since May last year, we've seen 430,000 unique users use applications over time, which is quite great, especially given, we took the approach of going to mainnet very fast, with a very short testnet phase. We didn't do these big pre-deposit campaigns. We felt, we want to go to mainnet and let apps build and then figure out what actually works. So we really started seeing growth from, I'd say, November last year. And that was when we started working with Bitcoin LSTs and this kind of Bitcoin staking ecosystem, and allowing people to stake their Bitcoin in Bitcoin staking protocols like Babylon, but then still use it in the form of LSTs and DeFi, something that was previously only available to Ethereum and now still in its infancy, but already available for Bitcoin. And that's also when our TVL numbers started to grow. We're around 200, and let me see what the latest is on L2 beat, 280 million in on-chain deposits, which puts us in position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on L2 beat if you don't count native tokens. So just pure real stable ETH or Bitcoin TVL. And that's just we're just getting started. So we're seeing this thing start picking up steam. We have Uniswap live on Bob. It's the 5th largest Uniswap deployment, ahead of BNB chain, ahead of Optimism. We have Euler that just went live, and they've been growing really, really fast and doing a really good job. Bob is also, this is all public in the forums, is in the very progressed stages of conversations and governance discussions with the Aave DAO for a Bitcoin focused deployment on Bob. Of course, still subject to final governance vote, but we've had very constructive conversations with the Aave DAO, how we'd like to roll this out and make this also a place for them to get more Bitcoin exposure. And we see also a lot of new startups that are looking at Bitcoin DeFi, also really oriented at different geographical locations, where they really focus on retail users borrowing stables against Bitcoin, creating Bitcoin-backed stable coins, but also projects on the intersections between Bitcoin and RWAs, really looking for ways to generate long-term sustainable yield from Bitcoin, but also being open to being C DeFi, which, if you know the risks, that can work quite well. So we see essentially a lot of inbound interest from new builders, apps to start building around Bitcoin. And just because how the timelines are, when we start with an idea, new startups come on board, we're going to see a lot of them start going to mainnet Q3, Q4, 2025, and really just grow further and bring more and more users and unique applications. So with that, we've been very happy with the growth of Bob, and we really see the biggest opportunity, I think, here is DeFi still. Bitcoin DeFi is still in its infancy, and still it is huge, right? It's billions of dollars already that have been bridged over to Bitcoin L2s and ETH and others L1s, using still, yes, centralized and custodial bridges, but it's still only a fraction of what we could access. And if you compare the numbers and the metrics, if you look at Ethereum, for example, the market cap to TVL ratio, it's at around 30%. Bitcoin's at what? 0.3, maybe getting closer to 1%, but it's still so far away. So we have a 30x to 100x growth opportunity here if we just reach the levels of Ethereum. But this is a multi tens, hundreds of millions, billion dollar market that we're looking at. And the interesting observation here, and Nick, we discussed this like last time I think on Twitter as well. We see that with the US embracing Bitcoin and many countries following as well, that a lot of treasuries are building up on Bitcoin. They're like buying BTC, but as a treasury manager, you have to earn yield. Your mandate is to earn yield. And sure, Bitcoin might appreciate in price and you could factor that in. And by all means, I'm not a treasury manager, but the feedback we're getting is from big custodians, big funds, big LPs, and there's a new liquid fund of funds being launched specializing in Bitcoin. There's a lot, like hundreds of millions of dollars worth of demand for Bitcoin yield. And they're looking for ways to actually get that. And that is where Bitcoin L2s like Bob are just positioned in the best way possible to accept that. But at the same time, of course, pair this with retail adoption, where Bitcoin is far ahead of any other asset, at least in the digital space.
Do you think Bitcoin DeFi looks in any way different from what we've seen with ETH DeFi or other chains? Or is it just, we're just going to rebuild everything that's built on Ethereum, but just on a stronger collateral base on Bitcoin?
Well, we already have, right? It's already all there. Like that's the cool thing. Like, and that's why we firmly believe in this hybrid design where you don't have to rebuild everything from scratch using Bitcoin script or like some derivation thereof or like come up with a new programming language. No, like we accept that the EVM, even though technically speaking there might be better virtual machine designs, it is the best because it is the most adopted, and that's just what makes it win. And by supporting that, but still providing tools and access to Bitcoin and access to like Bitcoin security and liquidity, well, you get all the tier one DeFi protocols and things that exist on Ethereum easily deployed and build out with Bitcoin focus. So that already exists. So everything you can do on Ethereum, almost everything you already can do with Bitcoin and Bitcoin L2s. What you see now is specialized Bitcoin focused DeFi emerging, as mentioned at the start of the call. That is very interesting because these are things that specialize in Bitcoin and the asset and the properties of Bitcoin as the asset, and are targeted at the different user groups that have BTC, of which there are many, right? Many more, I guess, or it's much more diverse than the Ethereum user base, where you have DeFi degens and DeFi funds and power users. Now, Bitcoin has retail users. They have TradFi that isn't a DeFi acquainted yet.
Yeah,
you have a lot of like people who are on centralized exchanges, and they know Bitcoin, so that's the one thing they can associate with usually. So we see a lot of essentially, I feel like yes, you see a lot of the same, but I do feel that there's a much stronger push towards retail and user bases that previously were not attracted to DeFi. And I think that's the biggest opportunity. It's really growing the pie, because ultimately every DeFi user is a Bitcoin DeFi user, like almost. The majority of ETH users have BTC. There's a lot of Bitcoin in DeFi on Ethereum. Yes, in centralized forms and whatnot, and sure, it's hard to access and whatever. And by improving security and accessibility, you can convert a lot of these users and let them use more of their Bitcoin. But at the same time, you have users that have never heard of Ethereum before or never touched Ethereum. Not because they're anti-ETH, it's just because they're just not experts. They know Bitcoin and that's what they hold. And maybe they hold a few altcoins just because they got airdropped through like Binance or some other exchange. But it's really Bitcoin that they understand and that they can associate with. Because that's the first thing that they saw when they got into crypto, and they have like a backstory of when they bought their first Bitcoin. So it's much easier to onboard these users where you don't have to explain to them a very complex proof of stake mechanism or how your L1 is like super fast and makes these specific trade-offs. Well, it's just, okay, it's secure by Bitcoin. You can use your Bitcoin here in the best possible way. That's very easy.
So in the ETH community, there's a lot of belly aching around the rollup centric roadmap. People are pretty down in the dumps about it, to be honest. I don't know if that's just a function of ETH BTC, ETH not really participating as much in this cycle, or if it is like a real fundamental concern about maybe ETH L2s cannibalizing fees from the L1, or ETH L2s maybe not playing that nicely with the L1 and launching their own tokens and kind of siphoning away some of the demand for ETH itself as an asset. What do you make of this? Is this something that concerns you as we start to bring rollups onto Bitcoin, do you think we're going to have the same fate? Or, I mean, is this even a problem?
I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think it's a problem in Ethereum because Ethereum right now is kind of in the middle. You have Solana, which is specialized in being fast, cheap, and retail friendly, and it's okay to make trade-offs in terms of decentralization and so on, but it's secure enough, right? For many people, many applications. And Bitcoin is Bitcoin. It's a currency. It's an asset. Nothing challenges Bitcoin as, digital currency, digital, whatever you want to, but as money. Nothing comes close. And ETH kind of landed in the middle, where it's like neither that it failed to kind of win, it's failed to challenge Bitcoin on the money side, but now it's losing to Solana with its rollup centric roadmap, where okay, you have a lot of fragmentation, and Solana is this one big monolithic chain that's fast and cheap, and it just focuses all its resources at execution and has less fragmentation. I think on Bitcoin, we will not have that big of a problem because, well, sure, ETH2s are taking away use cases, application, transaction volumes off Ethereum. Well, none of this exists on Bitcoin. Like, you don't have DeFi on Bitcoin. You don't have a lot of transaction volume on Bitcoin. You had ordinals, so people consuming block space. Okay, but they're not going to go to the L2s with the block space. They want to have it on Bitcoin L1, right? At best, actually, what's rather going to happen is that they can, ordinals users can post the data to Bitcoin, but then have hybrid designs, which they can actually use on the L2s, which gives them more things to do than just post it and then be able to transact it every 10 minutes. Like Bitcoin is Ethereum was such an upgrade. And I'm going to get a lot of hate for saying this, but like in terms of DeFi and usability, Ethereum is just way ahead. DeFi tooling, usability, applications, Ethereum is like way, way, way ahead of Bitcoin. But Bitcoin L2s are on par. In fact, they're better because they're cheaper, they're faster. They maybe are not yet as secure, but once you reach stage one, well, arguably, you're pretty well off. That's enough. You're secure enough, right? You have Bitcoin security with prop proofs, you're good. Even with like 0.5, right, with 0.8 with like sidechain designs or Bitcoin staking, you're good, right? This is better than anything else on the market, especially if you look at the ETH2 kind of ecosystem with a lot of stage zeros out there. And I think the biggest difference between like the Bitcoin L2 centric roadmap and the ETH rollup centric roadmap and the Bitcoin rollup centric roadmap is there is consensus in Bitcoin that that's the only way. There is no other option. Like we have no functionality on the L1. We don't want that. It's not going to happen. We're fighting and bike shedding over minor opcode upgrades for years. The only way that Bitcoin ever is going to get real DeFi is through rollups and working around BitVM and ultimately, hopefully, getting some level of additional opcodes that make it more secure. Whereas for Ethereum, it's pure scaling. For Bitcoin, it's actually use cases. And I think that is a subtle but very important difference. Bitcoin L2 are not taking anything away from Bitcoin L1. There's nothing there to be taken away, right? You're bringing use cases. You have a chance of actually bringing a lot of users, consuming more block space, and seeing more applications on the intersection of the L1 and the L2, like swaps and we're lending where like more logic happens on the Bitcoin L1 with things like BitVM, but still a lot of the DeFi stuff happens on the L2. So that I think there's a lot of synergy there to be explored. And you see like DLCs and more like RFQ based and intent based swap systems like, Bob Build, and there's Optimix and there's others now coming out that are specializing in also like leveraging what the L1 has to offer. So it's kind of in the middle and it drives more transactions and more block space demand to the L1. I do think long-term, we as a Bitcoin-focused L2 project, even though we're hybrid, we have to think about how do we contribute to the long-term sustainability of the Bitcoin fee market. That is certainly a concern that's been on our mind ever since we started researching Bitcoin 10 years ago. And that is something that we'll have to figure out because, of course, there's a balance between paying a lot of money for posting the data and then suffocating and losing to Solana because you're more expensive. So, we have to find a balance where, yes, there's contribution, but it doesn't, it's not extractive early on. Like, I don't think people should expect Bitcoin L2s are coming here to immediately dump a lot of data to Bitcoin to make the Bitcoin fee market go up so miners make enough money to keep mining. Bitcoin L2s are still startups. So you don't extract value out of a startup. You have to help them grow and work with things that are somewhere in between that kind of help both the consensus participants and miners and the L2s. And then gradually, when the L2s have won the market against ETH, L2s, and so on, and everybody else, well, sure, then there'll be enough fees coming in.
Yeah, I want to talk about fees in a minute. It's a fascinating question I get a lot is what does the fee environment look like on Bitcoin post true rollups? But one observation first, I guess, is another distinction is Bitcoin almost never increases the quantity of block space available. Well, they did one time, really, with SegWit, arguably. So they quadrupled the block space. I think that was it in the whole history of Bitcoin. Whereas Ethereum is constantly in this tug of war between trying to make ETH this sort of like monetary asset and then trying to fight with Solana and others and increasing the quantity of gas or effectively block space, which they do periodically. I mean, I think it happens all the time, right? So with Bitcoin, there's this like social commitment to never increasing the block space as part of this competition with other newer blockchains. Whereas with ETH, they're sort of like constantly pushing down the fees that validators get by increasing block space. So I think that's one reason also why Ethereum's like struggling.
I mean, I think that's a very interesting take, and it definitely contributes. I think there's more. I mean, as you mentioned before, it's not just about the fees coming down why Ethereum is struggling right now, but because it's in limbo between like different kind of markets. But of course, I mean, the fee revenues are getting sucked away by the L2s, and then if you increase block space, for when actually there's a lot of demand and like it becomes unusable again. So it's a tough spot to be in all fairness, right?
Yeah,
I think ETH is like in this maybe BlackBerry is a bit exaggerated, but it could become that if ETH actually doesn't innovate and decide what is it going to go for, like what's the focus.
It's not even like the technology is bad or the governance is bad, although I certainly have issues with the ETH governance. It's more like they have an existential crisis and they don't know what they want to be. And with Bitcoin, there was never even a choice. We had our existential crisis in 2016, 17. That was the block size wars and the layered approach won, the small blockers won. And that's just been the way. There's no other way than doing the layered model, whether it's Lightning or now rollups. So in terms of fees, and it's basically impossible to project fees in a dynamic system like Bitcoin. It's like so many variables. But is it fair to say that you think fees on Bitcoin will be structurally higher once we have a kind of a mature system of rollups in place? And also, like, how much is the burden on mainnet in terms of the data requirements for these rollups?
So I've actually just pulled up next in the other window the Galaxy report, which I can highly recommend reading. So that's a really well thought through report. I mean, there's of course a lot of debates about whether all the conclusions are indeed valid, but I think we can all align, right? The math, even without looking at the detailed numbers, right? If we start, like, even if we don't post a lot of data to Bitcoin L2 is existing, and if there is demand for Bitcoin L2s, the number of transactions is going to increase because you bring in more users, and these users have to bridge and withdraw the Bitcoin eventually, right? So just the deposit withdrawal transactions are moving between different Bitcoin L2s. That alone is going to increase demand for block space. It might not be enough to sustain the Bitcoin fee market, but it will contribute to continuous activity that is not as reliant on spikes where somebody launches a new NFT collection and then they flood the network. And then if you see then chains start to post data in some form, of course, that immediately means, well, think of it, you're just like, from a very simple perspective, right? When does Bitcoin network clog, or when has it been clogged in the last year? When you had ordinals or runes of BC20, right? Inscribers, go into frenzy and fill the blocks. Well, you have now basically it's just spread out throughout the year. You have just continuous kind of bigger chunks of data being posted, which takes up space on the nodes, but that is nothing compared to what the actual costs that users will have to pay, or like these rollups will have to pay. So I think, look, the math can actually math in the sense if you bring enough users, you can afford to post data. There will be, of course, an inflection point, and I think it's going to become a barrier of entry for like real Bitcoin rollups. Like if you want to become a full Bitcoin rollup, you have to grow to a certain size. So I do also see a future where there's only a few Bitcoin L2s, potentially with a lot of L3s on top, that, with teams that don't want to deal with BitVM or fraud proofs that don't necessarily have the technological capabilities, it will be commoditized, but it is definitely more complex than Ethereum L2 designs. So, and you have to actually pay the cost, right? That is a big difference where, and you saw L3s emerge when the L2 costs on Ethereum were so high. On Bitcoin, they aren't going to come down unless you have an upgrade, or we come up with a massive innovation on the data availability side. Or again, we go with this kind of semi-secure, like semi-rollup route where it's like rollup, but it's like basically optimiums what the data is, where the data is posted to another network that isn't Bitcoin, but that network could be secured by Bitcoin staking or merge mining, which arguably is pretty reliable. And we can actually, verify that that network is executing correctly. The data is there, so you can make it rather secure and kind of acceptable. Um, it's hard to predict how much data will actually be posted to Bitcoin, but it's certainly going to be more. And there is just, unless Bitcoin rollups completely categorically fail, but even then you'll have side chains. And if the Bitcoin side chains emerge, and they are emerging, there is more demand. There is just, you see there's a lot of focus on Bitcoin. Even with just side chains, you're going to increase the number of transactions on Bitcoin, moving in, out, and between them. And with rollups, you just add additional transactions on top. You bring more and more users. I mean, you have millions of users that currently can't use Bitcoin properly because it's too expensive, too slow. So I think no matter which way this goes, unless it goes completely to zero and sidechains are all dead and nothing, sure, then it won't really add much. But in all the other scenarios, it's going to contribute to the Bitcoin theme market.
Two questions. You've been generous with your time. This has been great. I'm going to put you on the spot here. Any soft forks that you think would make life easier for Bob?
Well, you can see me but there's a video here, but you can see my expression. So I'd say the following. From Bob's perspective, we've taken the roots of pragmatism and least resistance and like product oriented thinking. We'll work with whatever we get. If there is a soft fork that gets activated, it will make our lives easier. Certainly, no matter what we get. It might not be necessarily the one thing that we like for BitVM. I personally think that, Lightning already got 2 or 3 upgrades and still isn't really working. And it's like, actually losing in adoption right now again. It's going down. You have wallets and like exchanges actually going back and turning it off. It still has a use case, and I think it deserves to exist, but it's not the ultimate solution for Bitcoin's scalability and use case problem. So I think the next soft fork should be driven at rollups and L2s. Like that's what we should be focusing on. The problem is we're still a bit early to determine which of these potential opcodes helps us the most. We debate about OPCAT, TX hash, CTV, and so on. There are potential combinations with CTV and like other opcodes that could be useful. CTV itself doesn't help us as much, unfortunately. Like it's great, it's better than nothing. And the one concern that I kind of initially was, I made fun of it, and then basically I guess like Eric Wall made a very convincing argument of like more institutional adoption means more ossification. We don't have that much time to activate more opcodes. So there's I think 2 scenarios here. Either we take a long time and it becomes very controversial, and maybe we get one in the next 3 years, 4 years, and that's it. And then like you see, as you yourself said, Nick, right? The times between upgrades just will increase and increase and increase. The other, probably less likely option is that we get one and then a few others quickly after, where there's this window of innovation where institutions are open because they're still onboarding and they kind of see the demand of like and the opportunity to actually also make money off Bitcoin L2s in the ecosystem, and they see the benefit of adding a few simple opcodes that really allow Bitcoin to compete with Ethereum and everything else. I'd give this like maybe a % chance to be fair, but it is possible.
Yeah, to me, it looks like a geometric series where the time doubles in between every a soft fork, so we can expect one in 2033, maybe. Hopefully not.
I think it's going to be sooner, but
by 2030, fingers crossed. Last question for you, Alexei. What can Bob users look forward to sort of through the rest of 2025? What's on the roadmap for you?
so we have kind of two focus points on the roadmap: product and tech. Uh, Tech wise, Bob is becoming a ZK rollup. So we're going to be, because Bob is a hybrid, right? So we are connected to both Bitcoin and Ethereum. On ETH, we're going to be stage one ZK rollup. So that already improves security a lot. And it's a very important component to the BitVM bridge. And then we're going to be rolling out Bitcoin staking security. So really transitioning to this full hybrid design. We're an ETH rollup with Bitcoin security and a trust minimized BitVM bridge. And that is basically the end state for this year, right? That's where we're heading. We're on time with the roadmap. We're very optimistic of rolling this out essentially through like Bitcoin security in the summer. And then the BitVM bridge will follow shortly after. And then obviously, training wheels and gradual roll up, but we're really heading there at full speed. And then that will make Bob the most secure chain ultimately in the entire market, apart from Bitcoin and Ethereum, which I think is a very solid argument and just allows us to be very convincing within users, retailers, and institutions that, this is secure, this is going to work. On the product side, we have, of course, more Bitcoin DeFi applications, stablecoin integrations, on-off ramps, smart accounts, which really allow you to send and receive Bitcoin, paying fees for cents for fees within seconds or even faster. So because Bob benefits from a lot of the innovation that happens on Ethereum, we'll see our block times likely go down to sub-second block times, which just makes us feel instant. So we can do things that Lightning wanted to do. And it's perhaps not as perfectly secure just yet, but it's going to be more secure than anything else on the market and good enough for micropayments if people really want to do that, but also with stable coins and borrowing stables against Bitcoin. Another big thing will be, of course, DAO governance and participation in the network and the ability for users to really then vote on which upgrades going next. And I think that's very important for us and has always been, because building just for ethos and having the best tech doesn't make sense in our opinion. Our goal is really to onboard a lot of builders and users and work with them and their needs to make sure we're building the thing that the market wants. And that means giving our builders and users a vote and a voice in the system. And I feel that's a necessary and very important step in the life cycle of a network. And we're essentially moving in that direction and are very excited to essentially see this all unfold over the next couple of months.
Well, very exciting stuff, Alexei. You've given me some amazing explanations of rollups, which is honestly not an easy task. As I said in the introduction, we're investors, we're supporters of yours. We're very excited to see where you take it over the next year.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, super excited for the rest of the year. Bitcoin Renaissance is really happening.